All right, so I'm Phil. So I work at Harvard Innovation Labs. We are we're the startup. I left my little clicker right here. So we are the startup center at Harvard. It's our job to help students, select alumni who are trying to innovate, trying to create things, do that. Try to help them move as fast as they can, mitigate the risk, and do all that. So what I'm going to go over today is just a few of the things that I liked to work with companies on. My job was to advise them, to advise technology teams on everything that isn't technology, and teams that had no technology on everything that was technology. So, without further ado, I'm just going to jump right in. I also should say that I like to treat this like I treat my lectures, which is that I like to talk a lot more than I like people to look at the board. So this whole talk is gonna be framed around what I refer to as the laws of startup. And if, I know we have a few people in here who English is their second language, or they might not be as confident in English. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, you can always look back to this screen. So everything I say throughout this entire lecture is going to go back to these things that I call the laws of startup. So let's, before I do a deep dive into this, I want to address the title of this workshop, which is Technology versus Innovation. Now, innovations, especially open innovation, is a word that we hear a lot here. And I'm going to say something a little weird, probably a little strange, which is, I have no idea what the hell innovation actually means. I say it a lot. I apparently teach workshops on it. I don't really know what it means, but I'm hoping by the end of today that we can, even if we don't know what it means, we feel a little bit more confident talking about it. And so in order to do that, let's actually look at a definition of technology and a definition of innovation. So I got to come out here to read this. Can everyone hear me if I speak like this? All right. So we have innovation, which is the action or process of innovating. Thank you. All right. So we have innovation, which is the action or process of innovating. What's wrong with this definition? Anyone? I'm a lecturer, so I like to call it on the class.
There's two kinds of innovation. One kind is legacy technology, the other kind is emerging technology.
You're advanced. We're not going there. You're advanced. There's a definition problem here, which is the word is included in the definition. I'm going to take this as a sign that Google doesn't really know what innovation means, because they're defining innovation as the action or process of innovating. And then we have this thing called a new method, idea, product, etc. That's interesting, because if I look at how Google defines technology, they refer to it as the collection of techniques, skills, methods, and processes used. And so there is a very subtle difference between the two of those. Innovation, they refer to the outcome, the output, that is the product itself, the idea itself. Technology, they refer to the collection of techniques and skills, what makes this outcome. So one of the things I'm going to hope to prove to you today is that technology is an input and that the outcome is innovation. And that is very close to our fourth law, which is that technology is a tool. As I said, I am going to continually come back to these laws today. So, let's dive right on in. So I've said the word law, and this one's, okay, good, they're both on. I'm going to be switching microphones a lot, guys. So, we've said laws. So I think it's actually important, before we go into laws, that we go over exactly what I mean when I say a law. So there's actually two types of laws. There are theoretical laws, and there are empirical laws. So a theoretical law is probably the law that most of us are used to hearing about. And those are laws that we either derive or prove. We use math, we use science to either arrive at the law, or we come up with a prediction and then use math and science to prove that that thing is true. The laws of startup are not what we call theoretical laws, but that doesn't mean they're any less valuable. The laws of startup are actually similar to a lot of economic laws in that they are empirical laws. We observe them to be true time and time again. In fact, we observe them to be true so often that any time you meet a startup where you feel like they're not upholding the laws, my hunch is you'll be able to dig deep and find out why that startup is kind of full of it. So let's talk a little bit about these. So all of the laws always go back to the first law, which is zero in on the problem you want to solve. Now, you know what? I just realized I skipped something. I went straight to 1, but what didn't I go over? The title itself. One thing I also want to say is that these are the laws of startup. These are not the laws of new businesses. And it's very important, actually it's crucial to keep in mind that there's a distinct difference between a new business and a startup. For our purpose, we're going to define a startup as any new business that is working in an untested market. That can mean that they have a problem that has previously not been solved. It can mean they have a new type of solution to an already existing problem. It can mean they have a new, an old solution, but they're targeting a new type of customer. There's a lot of different ways that we can go into this. But the most important thing to realize is that from this moment on, I will be referring to startups. Let's go over a few examples. So typical new businesses are, if I start a consulting company, is that a startup or a new business? Everyone. What was that? I heard a bunch of people say the right answer, but they all whispered it. New business. If I start an accounting firm, and by the way, there's nothing wrong with being a new business. In fact, I advise a lot of people to do a new business, to not try to go the startup route. Startup route is far riskier than a new business. So, an accountant. Is an accountant a new business or a startup? Come on, guys. Come on, people. Somebody yell at the answer so I just don't feel like an idiot for, trying to goad you guys on. Somebody yell. You all know what it is. New business. There we go. Now, this does get a little tricky because sometimes things that are typically new businesses can also be startups. The classic example of that is restaurants. I can open up a restaurant and it can be a new business. But if I open up the first McDonald's, or I open up the first Starbucks, well, we actually are trying to scale something. We are trying to test a new type of market. So those things actually can be startups. So is everyone with me so far? Okay. The last thing I'll say, and this is probably, I'll have a few comments today that I think are controversial, but this will be the first one that's a little controversial. And I'm going to actually say that new businesses do not need to innovate. They are probably the only group throughout humanity that is excused from innovation. That is, new businesses must keep track with current technology. If I am an accountant and every other accountant is using digital invoicing for their customers, as a customer, I'm going to want to make sure that accountant is using that new technology. Otherwise, there's just an easier accountant I can go to. I am not expecting that accountant to invent a brand new way of accounting. In fact, I'd be really scared. That's a risk to me if there's this accountant who's saying, hey, for your taxes, we're going to do this never-before-tested thing. So new businesses, not startups, but new businesses themselves are actually excused from this thing we call innovation. So from this moment forward, I'm going to talk just about startups. And I'm going to make a claim that I'm hoping to prove empirically by the end of this session, which is, if you are a technology-focused startup, that is, when you pitch your thing, you pitch the technology itself rather than what the technology enables, that you are actually violating the laws of startup. It's okay, in fact, it's awesome to use new technologies. But if your first pitch is, for example, we are a blockchain SaaS company that does X, we're going to go over why that pitch probably is exemplary of a startup that won't make it too far. Not because of their product. You'll actually notice that I speak about product very little today. But I speak about reference frames and how you think about things a great deal. So, I'm going to make that claim again, which is if you are a technology-focused startup, you are in fact violating the laws of startup. And so now I'm going to try to prove that to you guys. So, let's now do a deep dive into these laws. All right, it's time to bring back the portable microphone. So I'll just let you all know I have something called a tremor. It just means my hands shake a tiny bit. So if you notice my shaking, don't worry, nothing's wrong. It's just a thing I was born with. So, zero in on the problem you want to solve. This is where we see, by far, hands down, the most startups fail. They are working on a problem that actually isn't a problem. Or in fact, they are working on a problem that isn't what we call the root problem. More on that to come in a second. But zeroing in on the problem you are going to solve, before you even have a solution, before you have a product in mind, this is the most important and valuable thing you can do to ensure that your startup will actually succeed. So I believe it was Einstein who said, if the world was ending in 1 hour, I would take 59 minutes to figure out what the problem is and 1 minute working on the solution. Another famous guy, Henry Ford. Who in here has heard of Henry Ford? I really want to know. Can you raise your hands if you have heard of Henry Ford? I'm not sure if he's actually famous outside of the United States. Okay. So I'm getting about 50% hands raised, which means I'll assume a 75 to 80% group of people have heard of him. Henry Ford obviously started Ford and did a lot of technology increases and innovation, specifically around assembly lines. But one of the most valuable quotes he has, which in all honesty I have no idea if he actually said. I don't actually know if Einstein said that thing. A lot of people make up quotes and then put famous people's pictures on them. But Henry Ford is famous for saying, Henry Ford is famous for saying, if I asked people what they wanted, they would tell me that they wanted faster horses. And believe it or not, a lot of technology and innovation around the time was around the horse and buggy. Right? And that's because, we're going to get into this later because it's going to sound like I'm contradicting the second law, but I'm not. But people were focusing on the technology itself. And they were focusing on a set of solutions. That is, they were limiting their frame of mind to the horse and buggy, instead of focusing on what problems do we need to solve. And the problem was this problem of transportation. So, we're talking about this. So zeroing in on the problem is this very important thing. Again, zeroing in on this problem before we have any idea of what our product is. We often say that startups are zeroing in on a problem and figuring out a solution. And everyone wants to focus on that solution right away. But that is dooming yourself to failure. Now, a lot of startups, a typical thing we find is that startups say that they are solving many problems. And that's a problem. Because you only have so much focus you can give as a founder. And both Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are very famous for saying that the reason they succeeded was because they were able to focus and zero in on very specific things. And if you're doing many problems, that's actually going to cause you to break the third law, which is everything to everyone is nothing to no one. We're going to go into that a little bit later. But what I want to talk about is something called the root problem. That is the problem that starts all other problems. And for any given startup, for a lot of startups, we find that they fail because they've actually found a good problem, one worth solving, but they're not tackling the root problem, the problem that causes all other problems. Anyone here familiar with the Toyota and the 5 whys? We got to get better at raising our hands, or at least screaming out, yeah, by the end of this class. That's my mission at the end of this, is I want you guys to be super excited about this. When I ask you a question, you're going to be like, oh, Phil, I know the answer. Please call on me. So, who's familiar with Toyota and the 5 whys? We got one. All right. So, are you confident enough to explain it, or do you want me to do it?
For example, the problem is A.
Yes.
So what's the cause of A? Is B.
Right.
Then what's the cause of B? Is C. You did up to death until you find the cause of the problem.
Right. Exactly. The idea behind the 5 whys, it's a technique that anyone in here can use to zero in on what the root problem is they're going to solve. So every pitch, at least every good pitch, should start with stating a problem. Not, we are a technology company, or not, we make artificial intelligence software to X. Instead, you should start out your pitch with, right now, the artificial intelligence scene sucks because of X. Or right now, people can't do whatever because of Y. But whenever you start a pitch, you should state a problem first, and then eventually get to your solution. So, if you have, how many people in here have ideas that they're working on? Whether you're in corporate world and you want to pitch a new idea, or you're a startup, just raise your hand if you have an idea you're actively working on. Yeah, I don't buy that at all. If no one in here has an idea they're working on, why did you come to this one? All right. So come on, who has an idea? Let's see some hands raised. Oh man, we got to get the confidence in this room up. So let the record show that almost no hands went up, and I'm not sure I buy that, but I'm going to continue. So when you say that first line of your pitch, the next thing you should do is ask why. And then whatever your answer to that is, ask why again. We call this the 5 whys because 5 is just sort of a rule of thumb for how long you should go, but I would actually argue you can do this indefinitely until you can't do it anymore. When you ask why and why and why, eventually you're going to come to what we call the root problem. And if you can tackle that root problem, then every other problem you're solving as a result. This comes back to that notion of focus. If you want to focus all your time on doing one thing, it would be great if alleviating that one thing alleviated all the other problems. Instead of having to do, I so want to go into number 3 right now, but there's an order to this thing, so I'm going to keep going to this. But focus is what keeps you on zeroing in a problem you want to solve and not being everything to everyone. So I'm going to go over another story that not everyone is actually sure ever happened. This could be a thing that just went online, a marketing company could have made it up, but it's a great story, and it really illustrates the value of the 5 whys and the root problem. So, in Washington, D.C., which is the capital of the United States, we have a lot of monuments, these tall statues and buildings that are used to remember people. And we have a lot of them. And in only one of these monuments, we were finding that the cleaning costs were insane. They were higher than all of the other monuments. And they realized that was because the building itself was rotting. And so they hired this expensive consulting firm. I believe it was a $3 million contract to figure out why this was happening. And so, because ultimately their plan was to basically redo the entire monument, a multi-million-dollar effort, and they wanted to see if there was anything they could do to avoid this. So this consulting firm, they asked the 5 whys. why are they spending more money on this building than all the other ones? And what it turned out was birds were pooping on it a lot more than other buildings, and that was ruining the materials. Well, who can guess why birds were at this building more than any other building? Anyone? What was that? I can't hear you, sorry. Sorry? No. Good guess. So she is the star pupil right now. All right. So, did you Google this?
Yeah, I know this.
You know the story. All right. So yes, the birds were eat insects. And so there were more insects at this building than any other building. And so then they asked again, why? And they found out that the insects eat this certain type of smaller bug that, for whatever reason, was at this building more than any other building. Again, this is the only monument in DC where this was happening. And so then they asked, why are there all these smaller bugs here? And well, it turned out that the lights at this monument were kept on slightly later and turned on slightly earlier than all the other lights at all the monuments in DC. So what did this expensive consulting firm, again, a $3 million deal, say to, what was their final call? Keep the lights off longer. And that completely solved the problem. By asking why, by zeroing in on the problem, by not immediately jumping to a solution, they were able, where are laws of startup? Thank you. They were able to get this done. And so if you leave here with only one thing today, I actually think this is the most important thing that any founder can do, is understand that they are searching for the root problem. And if you're pitching somebody and you say your root problem and you kind of feel like an idiot because it doesn't sound like a real problem, that's a good hint that you might want to focus on another problem. But only once you figure out that problem should you focus on coming up with a solution. And so, do we feel like we understand the notion of the root problem? I have two more stories I can go through, but I actually think I got to get moving. So if we're good with that, I'm going to keep going. So I just want to come back to this notion of technology and see where technology fits into the first law. You should be zeroing in on a problem without a solution in mind. We call this fitting a solution to a problem. Fitting a solution to a problem is by far, definitely at Harvard Innovation Labs, but I'm sure for other people in startup land, it is by far where we see the most startups fail, is that they are trying to, they have this solution in mind and they want to fit it to a problem. I have heard virtual reality career fairs 1 million times from different people, that we need to take career fairs and put them into virtual reality. No one can tell me why. No one can tell me what problem that actually solves. But we get these really weird things where we come in with a solution. Technology, a focus on a technology, means you're not focusing on the problem you want to solve. If you are tied to blockchain, if you are tied to artificial intelligence, if you are tied to virtual reality, and not tied to solving the problem, I keep saying that's why you're going to fail. I have a lot of faith in all of you guys. This was, so far I've noticed a lot of very smart people, but I'm trying to mitigate risk here and help everybody do startups. And so part of this is I want to see you guys put your right foot forward. And that's why you should never be concerned with technology when you're looking at the problem. You just want to figure out what the problem is you are trying to solve. Right. All right, so now let's say you solve the problem. Does anyone care? So, after the problem's fleshed out, we focus on our customers. All of this sounds like common sense. In fact, half of you are going to leave here and say, well, that was a waste of my time. He told me a bunch of stuff I already know. Startups solve problems. Startups have customers. But a lot of this is things we know intuitively to be true and then choose to ignore. We build products, or we come up with a problem we want to solve, and then we pretty immediately convince ourselves of a product. And who in here has read Lean Startup by Eric Ries? This used to be the startup gospel. There are definitely some flaws to it, but I still like it for a lot of reasons. This is the first time where I actually see a lot of people nodding. So good. So what I'm about to go into is something that I call the problem solution customer cycle. And the basic idea is this, is that you zero in on a problem you want to solve. From there, you start working on a solution. Before you finish that solution, and this is very important, you have to find out if people care. This is what we call the validation stage of startups. And it's what most startups think they can skip, but it's actually very important. And so in this case, you want to start working on a problem, come up with the solution, and immediately get it out there, even if it's half-baked, even if it's sketches on a piece of paper, and you're not really implementing the product like it'll be finally. You need to find out if people care. And you're going to find out, almost every startup finds out, that whatever they're working on originally, they don't care about. The customers just don't. I'm sure you've all heard that no business plan ever survives to see customers. That's a common thing that a lot of venture capitalists say, which is that they don't actually believe the business plan is what's going to be the business model. This is basically the same thing. I'm saying it in startup language instead of venture capital language. But the idea is you come up with this problem, you start working on a solution, you release the minimum version of that, what people in here might have heard of minimum viable product. And then through that, people say, this is okay, but you should change this. Now, where people mess up is that they make changes to their solution without constantly keeping the problem in mind. As opposed to going back and saying, is this the real problem? Does the customer have an issue with my product, or are they basically telling me they don't really have the problem? You need to go back to both. But if you have to choose one, it's far more important to reevaluate that problem. And so we get this cycle here. Come up with a problem. Test a solution to it. Give it to customers. Customers don't like it. We reevaluate what the problem is, maybe change that problem statement. That then has changes to the solution. That might change who our customers are, and then we go back and forth. You might have heard this phrase as pivot, but I want to be clear here. Pivot generally refers to, or when people do pivot, they are pivoting their product. It's far more important to pivot your problem and make sure that your problem, solution, and customer always align. And so for that, I'm actually the one sort of new thing I want to add that I don't believe is in Lean Startup, although in all honesty, I never finished the book. I only made it halfway through. It's a great concept, but it is very dry. But so anyway, we are going to, from this moment on, say a problem is only truly a problem if there is a customer that is willing to pay for it. And it is only the problem you are willing to solve if that customer is your customer. We often hear that, one of my favorite reasons that I hear startups fail is they say, we just couldn't find product market fit. What does that really mean? They're actually saying is, hey, no one wanted to buy our product. And that's because people are not keeping the second law in mind, which is, after the problem is flushed out, focus on the customer. Notice that solution and product are never mentioned in this entire thing, in all the laws of startup, which is something I named, by the way. There's no such thing as we don't even mention product. We don't mention solution. And that's because those things change all the time. And in fact, we often see companies change their name as a result of too much focus on a product. Apple computers becoming Apple, Snapchat becoming Snap, things like that. My computer did its sleep thing. All right, we're gonna go into what apparently is my favorite one. Everything to everyone is nothing to no one. And what this basically says is, this comes back to the idea of a root problem that you should be solving. These laws are all connected. They're not just sort of irrelevant sentences I decided to flush together. You should always be solving your root problem. What startups don't realize when they come up with their first product is that they typically have more than one product. I would say on average, and this is an arbitrary thing that I have just noticed, I typically hear 3 products from people. One is a replacement for some problem that's currently being solved. One is a new problem they want to tackle. And the third product is something they've convinced themselves they have to do that isn't actually relevant. So I'm actually going to use my first startup as the example here, which was a complete failure. So my first startup was connecting college students to people who could hire them to do short-term contract gigs. The idea was have MIT students build websites, have Harvard students write business plans. And while there were so many things wrong with this business model, where I ultimately failed was I was trying to be everything to everyone. I was basically saying to people, hey, if you need to hire somebody, whatever it is, you can come to me. And there was so much confusion in the marketplace. If you are a new company, the market, people around you, your customers, they really can only devote so much of themselves to understanding you. And there's really only enough room to make one new product. The famous example here, of course, being Amazon, who started as a book broker, eventually started selling their own stuff, and then became the store of everything. In my case, I was trying to be everything to everyone. I probably would have been much better off just saying, hey, let MIT students build your website. That's what we're good at. And then we could still argue that I wasn't getting the right problem, but at the very least, I wasn't trying to be everything to everyone. And so finally, well, first, how are we feeling? Is everyone understanding this? Good, I'm getting nods. I always like to see nods. Yep. And so technology is actually an enabler of everything to everyone. Technology gives us the ability to make new products quicker without thinking through, is there a problem that these products solve? Are there people who are willing to pay to have these problems solved? And like number 3, do we have the capacity to solve all these problems? Startups, as I've mentioned, are all about focus, specifically focusing on your problem and going with the problem-solution customer lifecycle. Technology should always be the tool that you use. It is there when you need it, but should immediately be forgotten when you don't need it. It's very important to consider that technology is not the thing. Technology is never your product. Technology, to quote this TV show, I think it was called Halt and Catch Fire, technology is not the thing. It's the thing that lets you do the thing. Now, as wordy as that example is, it's very important to understand. Technology is what helps you do these things. You should not be saying that we are a virtual reality product that does X. You should be describing why the world needs it. Everyone heard that? That was weird. if you are trying to make a virtual reality experience to, let's say, go on Mount Everest, and this is actually a real and very good virtual reality experience. If you're pitching it to somebody, you should be saying, hey, schools suck at teaching geography, and this is a great way to teach geography. Our first product is Mount Everest. Or if you are doing a virtual reality exploration of DNA, you don't just want to say that. You want to say why it's hard to learn about DNA as is, and then go into what you're talking about. And when we focus on technology, when we say we are a technology solution to do something, we are ignoring the people aspect of things. And so now let's get back to the title of this workshop, Technology versus Innovation. So we've spoken a lot about why technology should not be your focus. And then so that leaves, what is innovation? So again, the action or process of innovating, or the outcome, a new method, idea, or product. I am going to say that innovation is when you come up with a solution to a problem that hasn't been solved, or a solution that to a problem that has been solved, but that customers or someone is willing to pay for. And so keep in mind, not both of those actually require payment. One can just be a solution to a problem. And so we have this thing called innovation. Don't ask me about open innovation. I don't know what that is. There's a lot of experts on that here. In fact, I think there's a few people in this room who are going to be talking about it later today. I highly suggest you catch some of their workshops. But I'm going to say that innovation is thoughtful solutions to problems and thoughtful thinking about problems. So, thank you. I'm going to open it up to questions, if there are any. And yeah, really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause. So we have 2 questions uploaded in the Slido, and the other questions we will take from the floor. So the first question is that written in Korean, so investment philosophy. So could you tell us about your investment philosophy for our audience?
Yeah, sure. Don't take money because you heard you need to take money. We live in this world where, all right, so I once was speaking to the owner of a marketing firm, and she said, I was talking to her about how to get PR, and she's like, do you have funding? And I said, no. And she said, well, the only way to get into anywhere is to get funding. And there's this myth, and that was about a week before I got into Boston Business Journal and this thing called Bostino. There's this myth that we need funding. And when you actually look at it, who do you think started this myth? When we hear that we need to get funding, that's actually venture capitalists who do play a very good role. I'm not saying that you should never get funding. But venture capitalists come out with a lot of literature, a lot of blog posts on why you need funding. And because they are the experts in the field, we tend to say, okay, you need funding. And that's just not something that's true. In fact, there is a statistic on this. I believe if there's a startup accelerator called RevUp, and their founder, Alan Tier, posted an article a few years ago that has some statistic about how actually a lot of startups and a lot of new companies, ones that we have all heard of, actually wait very long times if they ever take on funding. So this whole notion that the first thing you should do is get funding, I find completely ridiculous. I will always digress to the laws of startup, which is find a problem worth solving, come up with a solution, and show you have customers. So at the very least, you should wait for problem and solution. Ideally, you have customers before you start to seek funding. If it's a completely theoretical thing, that's fine. It's much harder. but you should never be seeking funding before you know what problem you're solving. And if, are these anonymous questions?
Yes,
Yeah.
all
Okay.
the unknown.
So that we can't do follow-up?
Yes.
Okay,
The
all right.
second one, would you please? Please explain the Pagliluca Harvard Life Lab. How many teams are there?
So the Palooka Harvard Life Lab, I believe it was in fall. So we are Harvard Innovation Labs. Sorry, I actually left the iLab about a month and a half ago. But Harvard Innovation Labs has existed for several years. I want to say we were founded in 2011 or 2012. And we started off as one lab, the iLab, which was to focus on students at Harvard. We eventually added another lab called Launch Lab, which was to focus on alumni. And that's actually changed to our accelerator program, Launch Lab X. But in October, or maybe it was November 2016, we opened up the Palooka Harvard Life Lab, which is at any given time somewhere from 9 to 13 biotech companies that have a Harvard founder working on really cool things in the biotech world. So it's a wet lab facility right next to Harvard iLab. And if you actually go to innovationlabs.harvard.edu, you can actually see all of the companies at any given moment that are currently enrolled in the Harvard Life Lab. So that's great.
Thank you. And what are some typical red flags that showed up in the blocked angel ambassadors?
I'm not. I
So-
don't.
So a participant who asked a question, would you please tell us more about the detail? Yeah, please. 마이크 전달 부탁드리겠습니다. 두 번째 줄에 계시거든요.
So like I meant black angel investors as in people, you know, who try to take, you know, a majority of the shares without actually really providing expertise or helping, you know, the startup grow.
Okay, gotcha. Great. You're saying, how can you predict if that's the type of angel investor,
Yeah,
or you're saying once you've already given up your equity?
Yeah, more before.
Right. Okay. That's an interesting question. I would say, if I were to rephrase the question, I would actually just say, how do you know what the investor is bringing to this table besides money? There's not good dollars or bad dollars, at least not most of the time. Could this investor be, you know, in the mob? Perhaps, but more often than not, the money is probably okay. So then the question really becomes, how do you tell a good angel investor versus a bad angel investor? And I would say just how much do they really care about the vision itself? If they're more concerned with profit and loss statements before you even have finished your product or before you've found your customers, they're probably not the same, they're probably not a good fit. I would not confuse that with unit economics. I actually think it's very healthy for angel investors to focus on unit economics. That is, can one unit of your product produce sufficient margins? I'm totally okay with that, although a lot of people disagree with me on that. I happen to be a pro-unit economics person. I am generally against asking about pro formas and cash flow, because that means they probably are looking to get their money out relatively soon. And that's another one, is don't go with an angel investor where this is a huge, huge risk for them, because they will never leave you alone. You really want to go with an angel investor who does angel investments and where your investment is not a huge fraction of the investments they do. As far as telling, you know, judging their character, I would say that's an intuition thing. If they're really behind the vision, but they're giving you just a deal that you think, oh, this deal just really sucks, I'm giving up way too much equity. It depends how much leverage they have. It depends. I would say that's actually a separate question. Like, does the angel bring enough without the money to the table? And what are your other options? Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
All right, great.
Thank you. And the next question, what % do you think startup success in reality?
Less than 3. And that's being generous. Thought leaders. I hate this word thought leader, because in my mind, most thought leaders are people who And if you're a thought leader, I'm not trying to call you out personally. Most thought leaders are people who created a startup, didn't find that product market fit, but will come up with some line. Unfortunately, I started this startup hoping to change the way people shop for groceries. During that time, I had a blast, and I ended up working for, let's say, this is a fake story, by the way. I ended up working for Procter & Gamble. I did so much business through Procter & Gamble that I have now joined their team as vice president of whatever. What does that really mean? Well, their startup failed, and they found a job in a similar industry. They make it seem as if they had this client who took up all their time, and this was this organic thing. But really, typically what that means is the startup started failing. And a lot of thought leaders are people who had some product and decided to give up on it, and then just keep on selling themselves until they can eventually find some sort of job. And typically they'll come up with some story as to how that goes hand in hand with the startup they were doing. So to answer this question, definitely less than 3%. If you take into account the real successes, I'd say probably even less, maybe 1%. What else do we got?
Okay, and you mentioned technology is a thing, just a tool. However, if the startups don't have any technology but only ideas, then isn't it possible to get any investment?
Investment should not, all right, so there's a few things in this question. Investment should not be the goal. The goal is to create if it is a startup, then your goal is to create a scalable company, and investment can be useful for that, and sometimes it's not.
Okay.
So that's one thing, but, oh, sorry, there's just a little more though. Then the idea is if you only have ideas, so there's new technology and there's technology implementation. We had a startup at the iLab that made new chocolates. And I say startup because their intention was to actually scale, not to be a one-off chocolate shop. And they did not have any new technologies. So you might be right, they never got an investment, but again, investment shouldn't be your goal, and they could still do a very successful company without actually having new technology. And if, I'm happy to follow up if the person wants to ask the follow-up.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. And what type of company valuation is looked into these days?
Depends. So we used to have these things, there was just Series A, Series B, Series C. And then all of a sudden came the seed round. And then Series A became more money, and then Series A used to be in the hundreds of thousands. Then Series A became a little more money, and seed rounds came into existence, and those were the hundreds of thousands. Then all of a sudden, Series A became even more millions, and seed rounds are now 1 to 3 million, 1 to 5 million. And we have these things called pre-seed rounds. People are claiming company valuations change all the time. I just think the labels that we use are changing all the time. What I will say is I am seeing a lot more venture capital companies going into the pre-seed space. So that is new. So I do think that angel investors are going to see a little bit more competition from venture capitalists, but I also think angel investors are becoming a much more popular thing to do. So I think no one will really notice because there will be more angels, but there will also be VCs competing in that field. As far as the valuations themselves, I'm not sure.
Thank you. And what do you think of the most important thing for the startup ecosystem?
All right, so I'm going to take this question to mean, as a new founder, what should you be looking to get out of the startup ecosystem? If I'm reading that incorrectly, let me know. I think joining a co-working space is probably invaluable. I'll actually give a shout out to one of my fellow speakers here, Stas, who is involved in CIC, which if you're in a CIC city, I think they're doing a thing later today, I'm pretty sure. That's honestly one of the most amazing co-working spaces I have ever seen. I actually don't suggest WeWork for startups. I don't think WeWork is a great environment for startups, and I don't think they offer the best selections of services. Almost all cities are starting to have their own co-working spaces pop up. So I would do research, but even if you can barely afford it, being surrounded by people in startup land is so important. And by the way, all you're ever gonna hear is the same stuff I spoke about today. If you haven't heard that what's your problem before, it's all you're gonna hear. You're gonna start noticing that that's how everyone looks at startups. But once you just hear that over and over again, it's gonna just start to make so much more sense. So definitely join a co-working space, be surrounded by like-minded people, pitch, I don't know if this is exactly an answer to the question, but I think it's very important. Pitch your idea to everyone. Confidentiality is one of the dumbest things you can do as a new startup. The chances that somebody will take your idea are really small. The chances that they'll do a good job of it, that they'll execute well, are also really small. And then the chances that they'll do it really well, you'll also execute well, and that somehow that will be an issue for you is also just so small. So tell people about your startup, because otherwise you're violating the laws of startup. You're not getting feedback, you're not zeroing in on a problem, and you're not finding out who your customers are.
Thank you. Now we will take the questions from the floor.
Cool.
So anyone who have the questions, would you please raise your hand, and we will bring you a microphone.
Just about that last thing that you said about confidentiality.
Yeah.
Is it smart though to go in and, like, if I want to get feedback on my idea, to ask for like an NDA to be signed at the start, or does that make you look professional or just awkward?
Awkward. So
Awkward, yeah.
I would say that this is no disrespect towards you or anything,
I
because
haven't done it yet.
it's a great question. It's a really good question, and I would say that asking for an NDA is the ultimate amateur move. People at Coca-Cola sometimes ask for NDAs. It's their policy. That's fine. People get that they're under some sort of corporate bureaucracy. As a startup, I have two philosophies when someone asks me to deal with an NDA. The first thought that comes to mind is, all right, this is hilarious. I just want to hear the idea. I'll sign the NDA because I know that I'm not going to break it, that I'm not hearing anything new. If I'm asked by somebody I've never heard before to sign an NDA just to hear their pitch, it's too much work for me. When Harvard students ask me to do it, if based on what they say I'm interested, I'll sign the NDA. Otherwise, I typically have a no NDA solution, but VCs will never sign NDAs, and it will always be seen as an amateur move. The other thing is, an NDA is only as good as your ability to enforce it. So unless you're willing to sue upon somebody breaking that NDA, which is not the best use of your time, if I could add a law, it would be focus. And I would say that violates the law of focus. And by the way, I can add laws because I made those things up. So yeah. What else?
So any questions? Thank
Come on,
you.
one more. We're having so much
Yeah, one
fun,
more.
right? There we go. Didn't mean to cut you off. I just saw someone over there.
Hi, if you're someone who wants to be an entrepreneur eventually, do you recommend that person to spend some years at a startup or a corporate, or to found a business as soon as possible?
Depends on their economic situation. If they can afford to start a business as soon as possible, start the business as soon as possible. Is there value to working at a startup? Sure. But the notion that anything is entrepreneurial other than being an entrepreneur, I think that's a false notion. There is entrepreneurial thinking, which is, anytime somebody says entrepreneurial thinking, I might have said this already, it was in my notes, I can't remember if I actually ended up reading this, but when people say entrepreneurial thinking, what they basically mean is try to figure out what problem you're solving and zero in on it, find the solution. That is a thing, but I would say being entrepreneurial, the only way to really do it is to do your own thing. If that is not economically viable, which, let's be honest, in most cases it's not, and most founders have a great deal of privilege to be able to do that. Whether that's inheritance, whether that's even their own savings, I would still say that there needs to be some, you need to be able to fall back economically. If you can do that, there's no substitute for starting your own company. If you can't do that, work at a startup for a few years. You'll definitely get an education in what I call startup BS. One of the most interesting things to me is that every startup in the world is killing it. They're doing amazing. They're raking in the cash up until the day they close for business, and it turns out, what? They were never actually killing it. You talk to any founder, no founder will ever tell you how bad they're doing. They will only tell you that they're doing good, that they're on their way, something. And the only way to really observe that is to be in it yourself. And so I think working at a startup is great, but if you can afford to, I would jump right in.
Even if you know you're not ready.
What does that mean?
I think there's a lot of things that you can learn with less cost if you observe, rather than just going in not knowing anything.
Yeah.
But it's a hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you can't afford to do it, then working at another company is the next best thing. What I would just try to advise people in is don't be stalling. It's very, and I'm not saying this, you're stalling, because I don't know. But it's so easy to stall.
Or do you think there ever is something, do you think there's ever a time where you're ready or not ready to start your own business?
I think some people should not start their own business. I think you'll be surprised when you start it that once you start a business, you don't have a choice. It's not like you can really go back. You're in it. You started it. And so unless you're, I mean, so people always talk about startups as the riskiest thing you can possibly do. The way I look at it is you can have a job, but that job can, you can get fired. You can get laid off. In fact, that's what allowed me to start my first startup, is I got laid off. They got rid of my department, thank God. I was in banking before I was in tech, and I was not a fan of banking. I love bankers, so if there are any bankers in the room, I really do respect what you guys do, but it's not for me. But so anyway, I would say if you put yourself into the situation, you will be ready. There is a chance that you just will never be an entrepreneur, in which case I would say there are people who should not be entrepreneurs, but if you will ever be one, you're ready the second you start the company. I knew we
Thank
had more
you.
questions. Great.
Can we
Okay.
accept one more last question?
Okay. I'll be around, by the way, after this. People can still come and speak to me. I love to talk about this, so you won't be annoying me. Like, come to me all day.
어떤 나이에 따른 차이점이나 어떤 제약점이 다른 게 혹시 있을지, 아까 뭐 스타트업 창업하기 전에 스타트업의 경험을 뭐 가질 수도 있다고 했는데 사실 40대 50대에서 스타트업에 취업하기는 더 어려운 게 현실이고, 그런 차원에서 20, 30대에 창업하는 경우와 40, 50대 또는 뭐 60대에 창업하는 경우에 어떤 차이점이나 주의할 점이나 이런 것들이 혹시 있을지 해서요.
Yeah, he is wondering that have you ever thought about the age limitation when they start up, especially 40 or 50s? Is there any difference, the startups starting at the 40 or 50s or 20 or 30s?
You can be a good entrepreneur no matter what age you are. I will say this is personal observation. I see older entrepreneurs be better with the first law, that is zero in on a problem they're looking to solve, and be much worse with the second law. I see younger entrepreneurs just be horrible with the first law. And more entrepreneurs, more startup people, I should say, today are younger, which is why I think the problem one is a big one. But younger people tend to be okay at the second law. I do not think there's an ideal age. If we look at, I hate saying if we look at the data, so I'll say if we look at the stats, I do believe there's a slightly higher percentage success rate if you start a company above the age of 30 than below the age of 30. I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think there's any age that's too old. I think you can always start something new, and theoretically speaking, you're still not likely to succeed, but you're more likely to succeed if you're older.
네, 성공에 대해서 나이가 사실은 어떤 스타트업 하기에서는 크게 중요하지 않다라는 말씀으로 시작을 해주셨습니다. 특별히 그 아까 발표 때 말씀하셨던 그 법칙에 대해서 이제 언급을 해주셨는데요. 성공의 류를, 그러니까 성공률을 따지다 보면은 꼭 나이가 더 많아야 성공한다는 법칙은 없지만 조금 더 30세 이상 또는 그 이상이 됐을 때에는 성공할 수 있는 좀 률이 더 높다라는 또 그런 경향이 있다라는 말씀으로 또 마무리를 해주셨습니다. 오늘 굉장히 좀 시간이 다 됐는데요. 아주 알찬 강연을 해주신 필립 그린월드 어소시에이트 디렉터님께 여러분 다시 한번 뜨거운 박수 부탁드립니다. Thank you very much for
Thank you, everyone. This was very fun. Appreciate it.